Following the wedding, a devastating twist unfolded. The son passed away abruptly, leaving a profound void that seemed impossible to fill. Just a week after this heart-wrenching event, his mother received a letter from him that struck her like a thunderbolt, leaving her paralyzed with shock and grief. Greetings to everyone. We invite you to immerse yourselves in this story, subscribe for more, and activate notifications to stay connected. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. The sunset on the evening of Sarah and John's wedding was nothing short of magical, casting a golden glow over their ceremony on the beach. They had chosen this picturesque setting deliberately, hoping that the setting sun would bear witness to their deep and unbreakable bond. At the tender age of 24, their love story had been a whirlwind of romance and commitment, having met just 3 years prior. However, not all was harmonious in their union. Linda, John's mother, harbored a deep-seated dislike for Sarah. This animosity was often attributed to maternal jealousy, as John, being her only child, was the center of Linda's world. Now Linda was forced to confront the reality of sharing her beloved son with another woman, a reality she found impossible to accept. Despite Sarah's earnest attempts to bridge the gap and win Linda's approval, she was met with constant resistance and coldness. In contrast, Robert, John's father, saw in Sarah a kindred spirit and a perfect match for his son. He believed in her potential to be a loving and supportive partner. For Sarah, this marriage symbolized the dawn of a new chapter in her life, offering her the hope of a stable and nurturing family environment. As an orphan who had lost her parents in a tragic car accident, the prospect of finally having a family to call her own was a dream come true. However, Sarah's extended family was sparse. Only her Aunt Margaret could attend the wedding, as many of her relatives had drifted away over the years, leaving Sarah to face the most significant day of her life with a diminished sense of familial support. The wedding was meant to be a celebration of love and new beginnings, but the stark absence of a supportive family and the simmering disapproval from her mother-in-law cast a shadow over the joyous occasion. As the wedding festivities drew to a close, John and Sarah were eagerly anticipating their honeymoon in Paris. However, John had something extraordinary planned for his new bride, a surprise he was certain would fill her heart with joy. The night was drawing to a close, and as the guests began to disperse, John asked Sarah to join him in a secluded spot on the beach. He mentioned that he needed a few moments alone to set up the surprise and assured her that when she arrived, she would be greeted by something truly special. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Sarah made her way to the designated spot, her excitement mingled with curiosity. Yet, as she approached, an unsettling sense of confusion began to wash over her. From a distance, she spotted John seated on the sand, propped against a large rock, with the tumultuous waves crashing violently behind him. Given John's penchant for playful antics, Sarah initially dismissed her growing unease, assuming it was all part of his jest. However, as she drew nearer, the situation took a more ominous turn. John remained eerily still, seemingly impervious to the crashing waves around him. A sense of dread crept over Sarah as she closed the distance, realizing something was wrong. Her heart raced as she approached, and the sight before her left her paralyzed with horror. John was slumped against the rock, unconscious and unresponsive. In a state of panic, Sarah shook him vigorously, hoping he had merely fainted from exhaustion or excitement. But despite her desperate attempts to rouse him, John did not stir. Her frantic shaking and calls of his name went unanswered, intensifying her growing terror. As the minutes ticked by with no sign of life, the crushing realization dawned upon her: John was lifeless. The shock and grief of the moment overwhelmed her, bringing a rush of painful memories to the surface. She was thrust back to her childhood, to the moment she learned that her parents would never return home, killed in a tragic car accident when she was just 8 years old. The anguish of that loss mirrored the profound sorrow she felt now, as she grappled with the crushing weight of this new, unimaginable heartbreak. In a frantic effort to save her husband, Sarah dashed back to the wedding reception, her wedding dress now a tragic mess of sand and rips, her makeup streaked with tear stains, and her hair a chaotic ruin. She was a living embodiment of despair and devastation, a stark contrast to the joyous occasion just hours earlier. As she stumbled toward the entrance of the wedding party tent, every eye was immediately drawn to her disheveled and distressing appearance. Sarah tried to scream out the horror she had just witnessed, but her voice betrayed her, coming out as nothing more than a strained whisper. It was as though she were trapped in a nightmare, unable to call for help or make her terror known. Her silent panic held the crowd in a tense and confused silence. After what felt like an eternity of helplessness, Sarah was jolted from her stupor by Linda, John's mother. Linda, her face etched with a mix of dread and determination, shook Sarah with a fierce urgency, desperate to pry any information about her son's fate from the overwhelmed young woman. Sarah, barely able to process her grief, managed to utter the chilling words, "John is dead," her voice barely audible. With trembling fingers, she pointed in the direction where John lay. The impact of Sarah's words hit Linda like a thunderclap, causing her legs to buckle under the weight of the unbearable news. Overcome by shock, Linda shoved Sarah away, sending her sprawling onto the sand in a heap of anguish. Without a second glance, Linda raced toward the spot Sarah had indicated, her every step fueled by a frantic, almost primal need to reach her son. Behind Linda, Robert, Margaret, and a group of onlookers, now drawn into the grim reality of the situation, followed hastily. Their faces, once filled with curiosity and festivity, were now masks of concern and confusion as they hurried after Linda, driven by a growing sense of dread and the need to uncover the truth of what had happened. When Linda, Robert, Margaret, and the other onlookers arrived at the scene, they were met with the heart-wrenching sight that Sarah had discovered just moments earlier. John lay motionless, his lifeless form propped against the rock that had been relentlessly battered by the waves. The scene was a haunting testament to the joyous spirit that had been snuffed out in an instant. Linda, her face a canvas of sheer horror and disbelief, fell to her knees beside her son. Her trembling fingers reached out to touch John's cold, unresponsive face, and in that heart-shattering moment, she comprehended the cruel reality her beloved son was gone, his warmth and kindness extinguished forever. Overwhelmed by a wave of desperation, Linda shook John violently, her futile attempts to revive him only deepening the chasm of her grief. As she moved his inert body in a frantic effort to bring him back to life, Linda's eyes fell upon a grim detail, an ominous dagger embedded in John's heart. The sight of the bloodied weapon triggered a powerful shift from despair to seething rage. With a mixture of sorrow and fury, Linda pulled the dagger from her son's chest, the blood staining her hands and intensifying the chaos in her mind. Tears streaming down her face, Linda turned with fierce resolve toward Sarah, who was approaching the scene, her face a mask of anguish. Convinced beyond reason that Sarah was the architect of her son's demise, Linda's grief morphed into a venomous accusation. The thought that Sarah, driven by greed and the desire to inherit John's wealth now that she was his wife, had committed such a heinous act consumed Linda. She advanced toward Sarah, her eyes blazing with vengeful fire. Robert, witnessing the bloody dagger in Linda's hands and grasping her intentions, sprang into action. His heart raced with a mix of fear and resolve as he rushed to restrain his wife, knowing the gravity of her next actions. Linda, her voice echoing with a chilling intensity, screamed at her husband, "That wretched woman murdered our son. I must avenge him." "Let me go," her words were a gut-wrenching cry for justice and retribution. Sarah, hearing Linda's accusation, felt a deep, visceral shock. She tried desperately to convey the truth to the enraged mother, her voice trembling with sincerity and desperation. "I didn't kill John. I love him more than anything in this world. I would never harm him, especially not on our wedding day, Despite her heartfelt plea, Linda's grief-clouded judgment rendered her unable to accept Sarah's explanation. She continued to struggle against Robert's firm hold, her rage and anguish leaving no room for reason. Robert, now fully aware of the dire situation, shouted urgently for someone to call the police, hoping to defuse the escalating crisis and seek justice for the tragic loss. When the police finally arrived, approximately 20 minutes after the distress call, they were confronted with a scene of utter chaos and heartbreak. The scene was a harrowing tableau of despair, a lifeless victim, a distressed woman clad in a wedding gown, her attire now stained with blood, wielding a dagger with trembling hands while threatening another. The air was thick with the tension of a nightmare come to life. The police, faced with this chaotic spectacle, quickly gathered statements from witnesses to piece together the tragic events. Linda, still racked with grief and rage, was approached by the officers. They spoke to her with a mixture of empathy and firmness, trying to soothe her frayed nerves while urging her to lower the bloody dagger she held. The officers understood the depth of Linda's emotional turmoil and the overwhelming nature of her loss, but they impressed upon her that threatening Sarah in this manner would not bring back her son or honor his memory. With considerable effort, they managed to persuade Linda to relinquish the weapon. As the officers began taking statements from those present, Sarah recounted the sequence of events with a growing sense of dread. She soon realized that, like Linda, the police were leaning toward believing her involvement in the crime. Witnesses had seen John alive and engaged in conversation with Sarah shortly before he walked alone to the spot where he was later found, the dagger embedded in his heart. The accounts described Sarah's distressing appearance as she had walked alone in the direction where her husband had been found, only to return moments later looking disheveled and devastated, claiming that John was dead. Some of the guests, perhaps influenced by their fascination with crime dramas, began speculating that Sarah's disheveled state was indicative of a struggle with John before the fatal stabbing. Detective Thompson, who was leading the investigation, identified a significant complication: the murder weapon had been handled by Linda when she removed it from her son's chest. This act had inadvertently contaminated the evidence with her fingerprints, complicating the investigation. The detective emphasized the need to identify any other fingerprints on the dagger to determine the true perpetrator. Linda remained adamant that Sarah was responsible for her son's death. Overwhelmed by the shock and grief of losing her husband so abruptly, Sarah was unable to grasp the full gravity of her situation with the police. Her presence at the crime scene, combined with the fact that she had mentioned a surprise plan by John, only heightened suspicion. The police's search of the area yielded no evidence of a gift or any indication of a planned surprise, further fueling the belief that Sarah was involved in her husband's murder. During the interrogation, Sarah found herself ensnared by the police's carefully crafted questions designed to elicit incriminating responses. Caught in the web of their interrogation tactics, she was unable to see the traps being set for her. As the interrogation concluded, Sarah was stunned to receive an arrest warrant for the murder of her husband. Her protests of innocence fell on deaf ears as she was taken into custody, still in her wedding dress, a stark symbol of the joyous occasion that had turned into a nightmare. In the police station's holding cell, the other detainees gawked at Sarah's wedding attire, her suffering becoming fodder for their cruel jokes. The ordeal was not just the worst day of her life, but also a public spectacle of her anguish. The following day, Margaret, Sarah's aunt, managed to secure legal representation for her niece, and Sarah was released on bail. Returning home, she finally had the chance to shed the tattered remnants of her wedding dress, a symbol of her shattered dreams. After a long, hot bath during which she wept uncontrollably, Sarah resolved to attend her husband's wake, determined to honor his memory despite the darkness that had befallen her. As Sarah arrived at the somber setting of the wake, she was immediately met with a barrage of scornful glances and hushed, judgmental whispers. The atmosphere was thick with hostility, and the weight of the eyes upon her made her heart sink even further. The moment Linda, her grief-stricken mother-in-law, noticed Sarah's entrance, a visceral reaction erupted from her. She abandoned her place beside John's lifeless body and stormed toward Sarah, her rage palpable and uncontrollable. Linda's voice rang out with a piercing intensity. "You are a murderer. You killed my son. How dare you show your face here?" Her accusations were delivered with such venom that the entire room seemed to shudder. Linda's anger was raw and unrestrained, fueled by her profound grief and the gut-wrenching belief that Sarah was responsible for her son's untimely death. Sarah, standing there amidst the storm of indignation, tried to reason with Linda, pleading for the right to mourn her husband. She insisted that no one who loved someone so deeply could ever harm them. Despite her pleas, Linda's fury did not waver. She insisted that John's death was entirely Sarah's fault, a statement that was both harsh and unyielding. The air was heavy with the tension of their confrontation. Sarah, caught in the crossfire of this emotional battlefield, was desperate to explain the impossibility of her guilt. She maintained that it was inconceivable for her to have been responsible for such a tragedy when her love for John was boundless. Robert, who had been a silent observer of Linda's explosive outburst, finally stepped in. His demeanor was calm yet firm, a stark contrast to Linda's hysteria. He approached his wife, intervening on Sarah's behalf. "Linda, it's Sarah's right to say her final goodbye," to John, Robert declared with an air of authority. His support for Sarah seemed to stem from a genuine belief in her innocence, a small beacon of hope in the dark cloud of accusation. With Robert's intervention, Sarah was able to move toward John's coffin. The sight of her husband's still form brought forth a torrent of grief. Her tears fell freely, a stream of sorrow that seemed to merge with her words of farewell. Through her sobs, she whispered her profound love for John, lamenting the loss of the one who had been her everything. She agonized over the cruel twist of fate that had led him to that secluded spot alone, and she cursed herself for not being there with him, for not preventing this tragedy. Her regret was a heavy burden, one that would follow her into the days of mourning. Once the wake concluded, John's body was cremated, and Sarah retreated to her home, her world now a place of solitude and reflection. She faced the grim reality of a court trial on the horizon, a prospect that loomed over her like an ominous shadow. In the days that followed, she immersed herself in isolation, grappling with the unbearable grief of losing her husband and the weight of the accusations against her, as she prepared for the battle to clear her name. In the days following John's funeral, Sarah received an envelope that would forever alter her understanding of the past few harrowing days. The letter, postmarked the day before the wedding, bore a faintly smudged but unmistakable handwriting John's. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the letter, her heart pounding in anticipation. The note inside was brief, but its words were profoundly impactful. John's handwriting was noticeably unsteady, a reflection of the turmoil he must have been feeling in his final days. The letter began with an apology, a heartfelt plea for Sarah's forgiveness. He confessed that the surprise he had promised was not what she might have hoped for. Instead, he revealed the crushing truth: he was engulfed in a deep and overwhelming debt, his financial troubles spiraling out of control. The weight of his obligations had become unbearable, and John had devised a plan to free Sarah from the impending burden of his debts. John's plan had been both tragic and self-sacrificial. He intended to take his own life to leave Sarah with a clean slate, believing that by ending his life, he would spare her the anguish of dealing with his financial ruin. The secluded beach was his chosen place to carry out this heartbreaking act. The dagger he had brought with him was meant to end his suffering and erase the debts that haunted him. As Sarah read through the letter, she felt a tumult of emotions. The revelation was a devastating blow, but within the sorrow there was a glimmer of understanding. John's actions, though tragic, were driven by a profound and misguided love. His final act was meant to shield her from the harsh realities of his financial collapse, a misguided attempt to protect her from the storm he had created. The letter brought with it a bittersweet solace. Sarah could now grasp the depth of her husband's love, even in the face of such despair. However, this understanding did little to ease the profound grief and the stark reality of his absence. The truth of John's intentions and the heart-wrenching decision he had made cast a long shadow over her, a reminder of the profound loss and the complex web of emotions that had followed. In the quiet aftermath of reading the letter, Sarah was left to navigate her sorrow and the painful reality of the tragedy that had unfolded. The letter was both a final farewell and an explanation, but it did nothing to fill the void left by John's departure. The truth of his actions was now clear, but the pain of his absence was as fresh and piercing as ever. As we wrap up this heart-wrenching story, we're left with profound reflections on love, sacrifice, and the complex nature of human decisions. John's tragic actions and Sarah's journey through grief reveal the depth of human emotions and the unexpected ways in which love can manifest, even in the darkest of circumstances. So, what have you learned from this tale of love and loss? How has John's story and Sarah's experience impacted your perspective on dealing with personal struggles and the choices we make? We invite you to share your insights and reflections in the comments below. What is one lesson from this story that you will carry with you and apply to your own life? If you found this video meaningful, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful stories and lessons to you. Thank you for watching,